The supplies that we need for today are just very basic. We're going to be needing our paper and our pastels. I'll be demoing with oil pastels and with soft pastels. So know that whatever pastel you have will work well, right? The paper I'm using today is watercolor paper. And just as a reminder, the rougher the paper, the rougher the texture, the better it is for pastels. When it's rough, it tends to hang on to that pigment a little better. Know that any paper can work. It's just the rougher paper works best. Like I said, I'll be using watercolor paper, but you can use mixed media paper, pastel paper. Those are also great as well. So we'll be focusing on plants. If you only have a small set that only has like one green, one blue, one yellow, know that that's okay. You can still do a variety of color with those with a small set too. You don't have to have a large set like this. All right, so when it comes to drawing plants or drawing anything in general, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind, the best first step is always going to be observation. If you have taken our drawing series or our watercolor series, that's something I mentioned then. I mention it here in pastels. That is the best first step to drawing or painting anything, noticing. And so when it comes to noticing or drawing plants, noticing is incredibly important. Noticing that color change, noticing where that light is. In our previous session, we talked about and drew an orange. And even though the orange is one color, it's orange, right? When that light hits it, we get a variation of color, right? And you can sort of see it here. You can see that lighter orange, that kind of yellow orange, and then that darker shade of orange. It's one color, it's orange, but because of that introduction of light, we get a variation. That light helps something look 3D, right? If we didn't have that light, we just had that one color, it would look very flat, right? So that introduction of light gives us that variation in color, right? It's not just with that orange. So this flower, this Gerber daisy here, is red, right? But if we kind of zoom in and take a little closer look at it, I know it's a little harder to see on the screen, but we see red, but we also see some lighter colors, like a little bit of orange, maybe a little yellow at the tip. We see a dark red and a lighter red. And if we're really looking at it, noticing that light and that shadow, you see in the shadow here and here, there's a little bit of purple in there, right? Sometimes there's colors that we don't expect to find in our art piece, right? And what we're looking at. Even though this is a red flower, there's a variation of color that we find in just the petal. Right? And so a great first step with anything we draw is that observation, taking the time to notice where that light is coming from, where that light is hitting, where that shadow starts, and noticing that color change, even when it's one color like that orange or like that daisy. Noticing those darker tones, noticing those lighter tones, and noticing those colors that you don't really expect to see there, like those purples. So observation is the best first step that we can do. Even if you're not drawing from life, you're drawing from your imagination, it's really helpful to start off by observing, right? In nature, we see like bark on a tree is not just brown. The leaves on the tree are not just one shade of green. There's huge variations in each of those. I do want to encourage you this week to really start to notice those color changes around you, right? Noticing those colors that you don't really expect to see um, in those different objects and places, right? So, when it comes to mark making, which is what we're going to kind of hop into today, mark making, I like to say mark making instead of drawing because mark making feels less intimidating, I think. So, in our mark making today, we're going to kind of use several different techniques. We're going to kind of create our drawing. We're going to focus on grass two different ways. And then I'm going to talk about bringing in some flowers and a variety of colors. But there are a couple things that I want to kind of touch on before we start that drawing. Way back in our second session, an earlier session, when we talked about techniques, we went through a variety of ways you can make marks, right? And using the soft pastels and the oil pastels, right? And the truth is, you don't have to know each of those techniques' names, or really each of those techniques. The thing to kind of hang on to, keep in our mind, is that you can do a variety of mark making with it, right? And so you can see here in my examples, I have some layering, I have some smudging and blending, I have some scumbling and some stippling. So I'm bringing in a variety of techniques there. The next thing I want to mention is that it's best when we're doing drawings to kind of leave those details to last. The truth is, when it comes to drawing or painting, we don't want to add every single detail. Sometimes adding all those details in there can be overwhelming in the drawing, and we can lose kind of the focus of our drawing. There's too much going on. And so it's always a good idea to kind of leave those details till the last, till the end. And even then, only adding in a few details. And we'll see that as we do our drawing today. But just kind of keep that in mind. Those details aren't as important when it comes to drawing and painting. A lot of times we want to give that illusion of the image, give that illusion of grass, illusion of flower, illusion of orange. We don't have to put in all those details to get that point across, right? And use reference materials. Reference materials, like I said, are helpful. I have a giant file that I keep a bunch of images in there. And it's not necessarily that I'm drawing this particular type of grass every time, but it's helping me see that color variation, where that light is hitting, and it's kind of a base that I can bounce off of and create my own grass, right? So reference materials are helpful, not necessary, but helpful. And then the last thing I want to mention about the mark making is layering, layering, layering. It's not just one color, and you can kind of see with these examples here, it's not just one color. I'm bringing in a variety of color and building it, layering them on top of each other. And that's how we get that kind of depth, right? You'll notice here, you'll see that I've kind of added all my colors that I'm using as I'm making those drawings. One of the things that you'll notice with grass, these bushes and grass here, is that I've brought in a really dark blue and a really bright yellow. Adding in those colors that you don't expect, like that dark blue or yellow, really gives depth to the grass right here. Both ways, just doing the marks or even just kind of layering with the blending and scumbling. That's kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. And we are going to kind of continue on and do some flowers and talk more about details in the end as well. So let's go ahead and pull out our paper. I want to start off by talking about finding our colors. That's usually the best starting place is picking out those colors that we're going to be using. So I'm going to be doing this demo with oil pastels and soft pastels. And so generally, when it comes to doing a drawing, you want to find like 3 to 4 midtones. We did that with our orange when we were drawing an object. And so that's kind of a good starting place for drawing plants, right? Finding that 3 to 4 midtones, right? Then we want that darkest dark and the lightest light. And so my midtones here, I've got kind of a light green. Let's do a medium green and kind of a darker green, right? So those are my kind of midtones that I'm going to be using. Then my lightest light, I'm going to bring in that yellow. And my darkest dark, I'm actually going to bring in a dark blue. So I'm going to do the same over here. Just go ahead and find my starter colors, my 3 midtones. 1, 2, 3. My lightest light. And then my darkest dark, just pulling those out. And so when you get that lightest light, that darkest dark, that kind of is a way you can show where that light is hitting. So even if you're not drawing an object, if you're drawing a landscape or something like that, finding that light or figuring out where that light is coming from is the best first step. And so I am going to make my light come from the right. So when I do my drawings, that's the direction I'm kind of heading in. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of lay out my colors. So I've got my light green, my mid green, and my darker green. And then I have my lightest light and my darkest dark. So I have my kind of color swatches laid out. I'm going to do the same thing with my soft pastels too. Do that light, that mid-tone, that darker mid-tone, the lightest light, and my darkest dark. So this is a good range to start with, right? And so I'm going to kind of do a couple things. Of course, if questions come up, definitely drop that in the chat and we'll get to those when we get towards the end for sure. But the best way to kind of learn a new technique or process is to try it out. So I definitely want to encourage you to follow along too. So I'm going to start off with my mid-tone, my mid-tone. Having that kind of mid-color, neutral color is kind of the best place to start. You can go darker, you can go lighter, but it gives you that first color. And so I'm going to do that process that's called scumbling, right? So I'm going to go ahead, I'm doing that mid-tone. And that scumbling was just kind of that scratchy, right? So I'm just going to kind of, with my pastel, make some scratchy grass, right? It doesn't have to be in any order. The truth is, when we go out and we look at nature, not everything is going the same direction. There's a little bit of chaos there. So if you happen to go outside and notice some grass, you'll see that. You'll see that they're not all that same way. They're kind of, there's a little abstraction to it and that it goes in different directions. Hmm. So I've started off by doing my mid-tone. My next step is to kind of bring that darker mid-tone in. So we want to kind of start with that mid-tone and then add that darker, add that lighter. I said like my sun, my light is going to come from the right. And so I'm going to add my darker tone to kind of the left side of my piece. And so I'm taking my darker green and I'm going to just do the same thing. I'm layering it up. This is like not doing any blending or smudging, but I'm just kind of doing that same mark making, that scumbling, making those marks, right? If my light is coming above, coming down from that right side, I want my darker tones to kind of be on that left. It's not going to be like straight up and down. It's not going to be just on the bottom because that light is coming at an angle. It's going to kind of curve a little bit. Okay. And then once I get that mid-tone and my darker mid-tone, I can bring in my light mid-tone. And again, we're just kind of layering it up, doing that same thing. If my darker tones are coming in on that left side, kind of rounding out, my lighter tone is going to kind of overlap just a little bit. But I'm going to do that kind of scumbling as well. Okay, so I've got my lighter colors here going into those darker colors. Okay. That mid-tone is underneath everything. That mid-tone gives us the consistency, right? The lighter mid-tones and the darker mid-tones kind of start that light variation, right? So I started with that mid-tone. I added my light and my dark colors, right? So that's with the oil pastel. It looks a little different with soft pastel. So I'm just going to go over that right now. Doing that mid-tone, right? That same thing. Doing that scumbling. The great thing about using the soft pastels, and honestly why I like using the soft pastels better than oil pastels, is that you can get some nice points and do some kind of fine lines with those. You'll notice with my soft pastels, when I use them, I start to break them. And that gives me more angles and more like sharp sides. So I can get some more like detail that way. So I'm going to take my mid-tone, my mid-tone, and just do that same thing, doing that scumbling, right? Just adding those marks. It looks a little different than what our oil pastels did, but it kind of does the same thing, just has a slightly different appearance, right? So doing that mid-tone, kind of filling that space. Again, that mid-tone is that consistency of underneath, right? That's so everything is kind of tied in together. Then we'll bring that darker mid-tone in, right? And again, the same thing, noticing where that light is coming from. So that darker mid-tone is going to kind of curve around. We can think about how we did that orange the other week, how it's not that straight line, right? But it kind of blends in, right? So we're just going to kind of do that scumbling again. Scumbling is really great. Doing this kind of mark making is really great when you're doing nature. And a lot of that is because it helps layer up. It looks like grass. It looks like leaves. It looks like flowers. It looks like bark. This mark making, even though it feels a little chaotic, when you layer it up, it can give some really nice depth and can, like I said, look like different things you find out in nature. So I did my mid-tone across everything. I added that darker mid-tone in. So I'm going to bring that lighter mid-tone in, right? And I'm just going to do kind of the opposite side. I'm going to do a little overlapping where the dark is, right? But I'm going to do that scumbling again, that kind of hatching, filling in that space. I'm not completely covering up my mid-tone, right? But I'm kind of layering on top of it, right? So you can still see that mid-tone underneath on both of these. You can see that darker tone. You can see that lighter tone. So the next step is to bring in that darkest dark and the lightest light. And when it comes to grass, you'll notice there's a variety of color that can show up. I'm specifically using like a navy, a dark blue, and a yellow, a bright yellow. But sometimes you see purple in nature, right? The thing I want to reiterate, I know we mentioned it last time when we were drawing an object, but when it comes to those darker tones, when it comes to shadow and shading, black is rarely seen. I know in our minds we think, oh, it's a shadow, it's black. But the truth is it's not. It's just a kind of a darker tone, right? And sometimes that's darker tones in other colors, like those blues and purples, and reds, even and greens. But it's rarely ever black. And in all honesty, the only time I use black when it comes to pastels, or like just colored pencils, anything, drawing an object or painting. It's not to darken a color. It's to do a black object or to do the fine line drawing on top. That black really isn't used to darken colors, right? It's that addition of other colors. So here's the thing too. I'm going to be using a dark blue to kind of bring in that darkest dark. But another trick that's kind of helpful, it's definitely seen with like watercolor painting, but it works also with pastels, is thinking about the complementary colors. Using complementary colors can help create a natural shadow. So the complementary color of green is red. So red would be a really good undertone for a shadow. Not exactly for grass today, because we've already started with our green. But keeping that in mind, if you want to create a more natural shadow, thinking about those complementary colors can be helpful. That's not always the case with light, and I know that can sound a little confusing at times. But once you introduce light, you start introducing reflective surfaces. And so colors kind of reflect, and that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, it all goes back to observation, right? Noticing what colors you see. And sometimes it may be hard to kind of get into that type of like deep noticing. It may be hard to see some of those odd colors that are in there, but the more you try to notice, the more you look, slow look, the more you do notice those other colors. And so I'm going to start with my oil pastel, and I'm going to bring in that dark blue. And so I'm just going to kind of layer that again, the scumbling, I'm not covering completely my darkest mid-tone, but I'm doing the part that's furthest away from that light. So it's going to be a smaller section here, right? And we can see already with the oil pastel, adding that little bit of blue really gives it that darker look, right? The same with the soft pastel. Once I start adding in that little bit blue, the furthest away, again, not completely covering my darkest mid-tone, but adding that little bit of a darker color there really does give that kind of shadow feel, right? And again, it's not completely covering everything up. It's layering, right? And so we can see that that darkest dark really helps start to give depth to our grass here, and both that oil and soft pastel. Right. So now I'm going to do my lightest light. I like using the lightest color last when it comes to pastels, and I know that's a little different from other processes that we've talked about, art making processes. But when you're using pastels, they layer so nicely that using that lighter color last is okay. So I'm going to add that yellow, my lightest light. And again, I'm going to use that as my highlight, right? Where the light is hitting the most. It's not covering the whole space, but it's kind of where that light is starting to hit, right? And so I'm going to add that little bit of yellow to that top corner where that light is coming in. And hopefully you can see already, this is just a simple process, right, of layering those colors, thinking about those mid-tones, the darkest dark and the lightest light, and kind of bringing that in. You can see that variation and change. It looks like there's some depth here. We can see where that light is coming and where that shadow is starting. The same with the soft pastel. I'm going to bring my lightest light in, my highlight, right? And I'm just going to, again, not cover the whole thing, but think about where that highlight is, where that lightest light is going to be, where that light is hitting the most, right? And just kind of bring that in. And again, you can see that kind of variation and change, right? Where that light is hitting. This is on a small scale. We're doing just a small patch of grass. When we start doing our landscape, you'll be able to see it on a larger scale, that variation and change for sure. So this is kind of one way to do grass. It's just that scumbling, just simple, but still thinking about the range in tones, right? Where that light is hitting, where that shadow is coming in. Another way to do it where there's not as much detail. Here, there's a lot of detail and can sometimes feel a little busy. Another way to do that, we can do a lot of like blending and smudging. This is kind of like what I enjoy the most because I like getting it on my hands. I like really rubbing it in the paper and blending those colors together. So I'm going to use the same colors, right? And start with I'm going to start with my lighter mid-tone. There's no real like hard and fast, like always start with this color. I think generally it's a good idea to start with your mid-tones before going to the darkest dark and the lightest light. Those mid-tones are a good place to start, but it doesn't matter which of those mid-tones you start with. And so I'm going to start with my light mid-tone. And I'm just going to, with my oil, I'm just going to kind of color in a space, right? I'm still going to think about the light hitting from the right and that shadow being on that bottom left, right? So I've got my light mid-tone here colored down. I'm going to do the same with my soft pastel. Just kind of color that surface in, right? And I've got a pretty solid color patch. I've added a lot of color here, and I'm going to lift it up so you can see. There's just a little bit of that paper coming through, but I've added plenty of pigment here. My next step is going to add that mid-tone and just kind of, again, think about where that light is hitting and where that shadow is starting, right? So I'm going to leave kind of that lighter color on that top right, and I'm going to come around with my mid-tone, that mid-tone green, and just kind of do the same thing, kind of color that in a little bit, right? Leaving, again, where that light is hitting, but just kind of filling in some of that space, starting that transition from where that light is, that transition from that lightest mid-tone to that darkest. I'll do the same over here with my soft pastel. Start with that mid-tone green, mid-tone. and do the same thing. And you can see like when I'm coloring in, drawing it in, mark making, that I'm not doing all the same direction. I'm kind of giving it a little chaos. Um, there's no like hard and fast rule that you have to do it this way. I just find it's easier to blend and smudge when it's not all the same direction. But it really is whatever feels best and easier for you, for sure. So my next step is to bring in that darker mid-tone, right? And so I'm going to bring that darker mid-tone, again, kind of coloring in, noticing where that light is hitting, and just kind of bringing that around. Okay? I'll do the same with my soft pastel. Just kind of bringing that darker tone in and bringing it around. And then this is where that smudging comes in handy. Now that we've got our base colors laid out there, you can take your finger, you can take a tortilla, a Q-tip, a smudging stick. I like using my fingers, so I'm going to use those. But I'm going to start with when you're doing smudging and you have a range of color, range of tones, you always want to start with the lightest and work your way to the darkest. And so when I'm doing that blending, I'm going to start with that dark or that lightest color and just kind of blend that together, right? And kind of gradually go into those darker tones, right? And just kind of following that around. We're bringing that lighter color into those darker tones and mixing them together, right? If we go back up, we're bringing those darker tones in, and sometimes that can cover up the lighter tones when you're doing that smudging, right? That mixing. I'm going to come over here and do the same with my soft pastel, starting with that lighter tone and gradually working my way into those darkers. We've got this nice smooth transition from those darker colors to the lighter colors. Now this works for grass, but it also works for like bushes and trees, like the leaves and stuff. But I think an important step in doing grass this way, starting off this way, is seeing, in a small way, seeing how that layering works and the range and color that we can get, right? So we've done some layering here. We've layered our colors. We've done some smudging where we're kind of mixing in those different colors to get that smooth transition from where that lightest part is hitting and that shadow starts. And when I talk about like combining colors that you don't really expect, it really does add that shadow, right? That darkest dark. And so I'm going to layer up. I'm going to start with my darkest dark here. And I'm just going to kind of do just a little bit of stippling, some dots, and a little bit of scumbling where those darkest darks are. I'm not covering up that whole space, right? Just kind of adding that in a little bit. And I realize I just put oil over soft pastel. But anyway, this is a good example of seeing how it doesn't blend in well. It's a mark that's right on top. So I'm going to do the oil pastel with the oil. Just kind of do a little bit of scumbling, right? A little bit of stippling, bring that color in. Okay? And then I'm going to go back through my midtones, right? So I'm going to start with my darkest midtone and kind of do a little stippling, a little layering. Okay? Do some of the mid-tone and that lightest midtone and bringing everything in. And then with my lightest light, right? That lightest light, come over the top. And do the same here. I'm going to do that darkest tone. I'm going to start with that darkest mid-tone and do the same thing. Let it kind of overlap some of that shading, right? That mixing, that's smudging. Bringing that lightest tone in. And then that lightest light. Right. So that's another way to kind of get that layering in there, right? I think this is a nice way. We've just done grass, bush, tree, that kind of stuff here. But once you've got that base, you can draw on top of it. Let's say I want some um, little bit of like white flowers maybe on here. I can add some of that here. And again, it kind of adds another layer. The truth is, when it comes to those details, we don't have to have every exact detail, every single petal. It's giving that kind of illusion, right? So these are a couple ways to kind of do that. I want to talk a little bit about doing something like flowers. So I found this in one of my thrift store books. But I want to talk about not using all the detail here. So this is the example I'm going to be working off of. You can see this is a hydrangea. Well, no, what is that? Geranium? Those are leaves of geranium. But you can see the flowers here. There's a lot of petals. There's a lot of individual flowers. If I were to sit down and draw every single one of them, it would be kind of overwhelming. There's so much detail that it's hard to read. It works well in a photo, right? But when it comes to that drawing or painting, we don't have to add all that detail. If we look closely at this image, we can see that there's some pink, right? There's some white, there's some red, there's little bits of green in there. There's a variety of color. I don't have to draw every little petal. I don't have to draw a whole bunch of flowers there. I can give that illusion of flowers, right? And so what I want to do is just kind of walk through how to kind of set that up. And I want to encourage you to really kind of play with it. I know play is not something, it's not a word we typically use as adults, but kind of experiment with this. Kind of doing a drawing and not adding all that detail, thinking about the most important lines, the most important shapes, that transition of color, and what exactly you do need to get that idea across. So when it comes to drawing something like this, I have a little trick that helps me. I'll either take my glasses off and look at it, or I'll squint. And what that does is it tells me the most important shapes and the most important colors, like the biggest colors, right? So if I squint and I look at my piece here, if I squint, I can see there's like a medium pink and a very, very pale pink that stand out. So those are the colors that I'm going to kind of start with. I'm not thinking about all those little here. In the petal, you see there's a lot of variation even in one petal. I'm not thinking about all that detail. I'm starting off with just kind of that, those base colors, those pinks, those two pinks, right? So I'm going to start off just by taking, and I'm going to use my oil pastel here. Yeah. And I'm just going to start off by kind of squinting, noticing where those colors are, right? And kind of adding that in, doing some more of that scumbling, right? That's stippling. That's a great way to get those base colors, right? And then I can add to it, add those darker colors, those darker tones, right? I'm not thinking about all the detail, the individual color changes, right? That's happening within the petals, but I'm kind of taking my time, noticing those big splotches of color, right? And already we can see in my drawing that just that scumbling, just that stippling is giving that illusion of that flower, right? All those petals. It also works with the soft pastels, doing those lighter colors, right? Starting with that stippling, that scumbling, noticing that round shape, noticing where the light is hitting, noticing where those light colors are, adding those little bits in. And then bringing in some of that those darker pinks. Gives that variation and change. You can see, again, it's not doing a whole lot of detail, right? But it's adding those marks that help give the illusion of detail, right? So it's not as busy. I can bring in like a white for that top part, right? I get carried away and want to go right across the board. So soft pastels, oil pastels, just kind of bring that white in so it softens up some of those pinks. Yeah. And you can see that even though I've just been doing that scumbling, there wasn't a lot of detail. I didn't have sharp edges. I wasn't putting in that detail, but I was thinking about those color changes and how it does give that illusion. In this, there's some red that I can bring in. And so I may take, like for my piece here, I see there's like little bits of red. So I can come in with my red pastel and just add a couple pieces, little dots, stipples of the red, and can already see more of a transition in color. So this image here, the stippling, so because there's a lot of individual petals here, that stippling, that scumbling is a great way to kind of give that illusion of petals. For the leaf here, it's basically one petal, one leaf. And so you can do that in a different way. You can actually, so what I'm going to use for this one, I'm going to start with my darkest mid-tone, and I'm just going to kind of create that shape that I see, right? And then add in some of those lighter lights and then that darker. So again, it's not like it's not drawing all the detail that I see, but it's making sure I'm adding that range of color. You can do stippling. Stippling is really great when you have a bunch of individual pieces that you're wanting to combine, make it look like several different petals, several blades of grass. But if you're doing a leaf like this, it's big enough that you can actually just kind of make that mark and then kind of focus on like adding those leaves, if that makes sense. But I do want to encourage playing around with it too. You may find that stippling the leaves looks better to you, and that's okay. You know, all these tips and tricks and techniques are helpful, and you can use them and have a successful drawing, but you can also ignore every single one of them and still have a successful drawing. So take what's helpful, play around with it, find what works best for you, and ignore the rest. It's kind of my philosophy when it comes to learning different processes for sure. The three thoughts that I want to leave with you today is one, those details, we don't have to add all of those in. We're giving the illusion of whatever we're drawing, right? Noticing is important. Noticing where that light is, where that shadow is coming in, and how that color transitions, right? Noticing those colors that we wouldn't expect to see. So notice those colors that you wouldn't expect to see. Take time to slow look. And then doing multiple techniques, layering, adding like smudging and blending, overlay, scumbling, stippling, all those different techniques. And again, it's not important to know those names. It's not even important to know each of those techniques, but just knowing that you can use your tools here in a variety of mark making ways. Thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask or email us at our contact@Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.